Okay, good morning. Dr. Gemara. So yesterday we had said that, excuse me, that we had Paskin like Rabbi Yehuda as it related to Shachris. Because the Paskin like Rabbi Yehuda by Shachris in relation to the fact that it said in the Mishnah in Eduyos, we're going to get now, the discussing today, tomorrow, how they came to have those Mishnayos and Eduyos. But before I go further, there's two things that I didn't mention yesterday that I wanted to mention. One was the kash on the Gemara that I had. The Gemara told us on Chavav, on Beis, we discussed the machlokes from Yosef Rabbi Chanina and Rabbi Shimon Levi as to what is the reason that we got to three tefillos in a day. Either it's tefillos avos tiknum or tefillos hineged tmidin tiknum. If you look at the Gemara on Lamed Aleph and Aleph on the bottom, the Gemara tells us on Lamed Aleph on the bottom that we're going to have in a couple of weeks. The Gemara says over there, Yochol Yispal Kol Yom Kulei. Maybe you think a person should daven a whole day. But before Daniel, we already learned in Daniel, Uzinin Tilasa, that you have 3 times a day to daven. If you look in the Yerushalmi in the beginning of the 4th parak, Yerushalmi in the beginning of the 4th parak also says that how do you know that there's 3 different times to daven? You learn out of Daniel. So I was wondering, is the Yerushalmi telling us a different sort of a source? Sounds like it is. Is that different than this? That is to say, perhaps there's a third option to show us how you know that there were 3 tefillos in a day. That was number one. Second point I wanted to do was Rabbeinu Yaina. Rabbeinu Yaina was in relation to the topic that we just ended with yesterday. So if you recall, as we said, Rabbi Yehuda told us that you could daven the whole 4th hour, so you could daven shachris until 10. And we passed like Rabbi Yehuda because the Mishnah in Eduyos is like Rabbi Yehuda. Fine. And then we asked the question that we left off with is what about by mincha? Is mincha, do we pass like Rabbi Yehuda also? In other words, that according to Rabbi Yehuda, since you can only daven mincha until plag and mincha, and after that to the time for Ma'ariv, do we say that according to Rabbi Yehuda, the proper time to daven Ma'ariv is already after plag and mincha, and do we pass like that, or do we pass like the Rabbanon, they really get daven mincha all the way until Shkia, and then after that is the proper time for Ma'ariv? That, if you recall from the Gemara that we said yesterday, wasn't clear. The Gemara told us in the end, we're not sure. We have rayas like this and rayas like that. On the one hand, we have a raya that Rav used to daven Shal Erev Shabbos. He used to daven Shal Shabbos Be'erev Shabbos. He would daven Ma'ariv. He would daven for Shabbos on Friday. On the other hand, we have Rav Huna and other rabbis who would wait until the nighttime. And so it seemed that you could go like Rabbi Yehuda, not go like Rabbi Yehuda. The Gemara, in fact, Paskins like that. The Gemara says, in fact, that the halacha is, since Hilchos Eloi Kamar B'Loi Kamar, David Kamar Avad, David Kamar Avad. Whatever you do is fine. If you want to daven Ma'ariv after Plag, no problem. If you want to daven Ma'ariv only after Shkia, no problem. That's how the Gemara seems to conclude. Now, if we go to Rabbeinu Yaina, Rabbeinu Yaina here is in the Daf Arif, in my Daf Arif is Yudchet Amud Beis. And so we just have to run quickly through this Rabbeinu Yaina. It's very interesting Rabbeinu Yaina because it applies practically for those who are considered about Tartei de Sasre, Mizman Hazen, davening, for example, too early on Friday. Says the Rabbeinu Yaina, David Kamar David Kamar Afa Pisha near Mikan. Shim Yirtzi Yochel Espal Aris Plag Min Chaveilach, even though it seems that somebody would like to daven Ma'ariv early from Plag. Dil Rabbi Yehuda Misham Be'elach and Zman Tfilas Mincha. The Rabbi Ule Divrei Rabbanon Yochel Espal Min Chada Erev. Afiloch Ein Lo Adam Lasas Binyan. A person should not do something that's going to make his custom seemingly contradict one another. A person is going to normally daven from plaga mincha and on. That is to say, a person is going to hold like the Rabbanon and daven mincha all the way until Shkia. Sometimes a person is going to daven early before Shkia, like Rabbi Yehuda, meaning he's davening Ma'ariv after Plag. Nimshad Dvar Saisin says that it's going to end up going to be contradicting each other. Sometimes you're making the time from Plag to Shkia as day. Sometimes you're making it as night. That's very confusing. That you're making a steer between the two, of how you're looking at the time. Eliezer kol shor kimay rabbanon. Rather, a person should do the way the rabbanon is. Sheyispel mincha ad shkia sachama. They should daven mincha until shkia. But tfilas arv is achar kach, and daven ma'ariv after shkia. Right, that's what we do it here. Right, we have mincha before shkia, ma'ariv right after. Like Rabbi Yehuda, or do it always like Rabbi Yehuda. Sheyispel mincha lo'olam ad plag bilvad, or daven until plag mincha. Like Rabbi Yehuda says, that's what you should do normally, and that's it. And then after you can spell, you can be davening marv after plaga mincha. But I feel kind of shkias cham, even if you do it before shkia, that's fine. But you're doing it always like a Yehuda. But actually, came shemin hagenu spell tfilas mincha plaga mincha. Okay, Rabbanan. Now, since our custom is that we daven mincha after plaga mincha, like the Rabbanan, ein lanu spell tfilas lavish kem shkias chama. We should not daven marv earlier than shkia, right? Which therefore causes a problem when on Friday nights in the summer, right? Because on Friday nights in the summer, if you daven 7 o'clock, if the whole year long, what have you done? You're davening like the Rabbanan, that is to say, you're davening mincha before Shkia and davening after Shkia. Then why is it on Friday afternoon, Friday in the summer, that you're davening mincha at 7, right? It's going to be before Shkia. You're going to daven before Shkia, right? What you're doing, you're davening, and you're doing it wrong according to all shittas. You're doing it after Plag for mincha. So like you're going with the Rabban, you're going to Shkia, but you're davening Ma'ariv early, right? You're davening Ma'ariv early. You're doing it before Shkia, which is not like the Rabban, which would be like every Huda. So that's a tied to the Sasri. So this is the point of the Rabbeinu Yoina. I should also mention the bottom of the page. Yeah, in the bottom of the page, Rabbeinu Yoina says that he quotes Rabbeinu Haigain, also says the same. He says, "Kim shefar nagu ha'olam l'spal minchat shkias achama ein lo l'spal arvis elam shkias achama ve'elech elav yishatzarach l'hakta ba'avod dvar mitzvah sheyesh le'lasis." Says Rabbeinu Haigain that since a person normally davens minchat till shkia, that's what he should normally do, unless you have a mitzvah, unless you have some important thing to do, which would then give you permission to daven ma'ariv early. And then we can get into a debate about whether or not there's a dvar mitzvah here that would count. For example, having a meal with your kids on a Shabbos at a normal hour. We'll leave that on the side. Yes? Okay, back to our Gemara. So now where are we? We are on Chaf Zayin Amud Aleph, right after the word David Kamaravad. So it's about 5-6 lines up from the bottom of the page. Rav Iklu de Geneva, Social Shabbos. Rav was at Geneva's house. Remember? We just had Geneva the other day. Right, we talked about Geneva, where Rabbi Yosef had said that Hashem should forgive Geneva because what he's clearly not saying the truth, and we pointed out that Geneva had a bit of a colorful story. Aside from his name being colorful, he had a colorful story in the sense that that he ended up. The Gemara in Gittin tells us he got into an issue with Mar Ukva, and he ended up in a situation where he was sent to the gallows. And we discussed that last time. Okay. So it continues the Gemara. So when Rav got to Geneva's house, V'tzol Shabbos be'erev Shabbos. The story was that he davened, like we just saw. He davened Shabbos, meaning Friday night davening for Shabbos. He davened on Erev Shabbos. V'havim matzli Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba la'achirel. And at Geneva's house, there was also Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba who was davening behind him. The Havmatz Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba la'achir the Rav. He was davening there as well. V'sim Rav lo'y paschal l'susa de Rabbi Yirmiyah. And when Rav finished davening, which he finished earlier than Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba, he didn't go and interrupt the davening of Rabbi Yirmiyah in the sense of walking in front of him. If you look at Rashi, the bottom line, right, of the page, Rashi says, "V'loy paschal l'susa l'kolem v'loy hifsik bein Rabbi Yirmiyah u'la'koisa la'avar l'fana v'leishev b'mkemei." So wherever Rav was davening, he could have walked in front of Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba to get to his seat, and he didn't. Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba was davening sort of near the wall, and he didn't walk in front of him to get to his own seat. And what did he do? He instead just stood. Says the Gemara. What do we see from here? Shemami no tlas. We see from here three things. Shemami no mispal adam shoshas be'erev Shabbos, like our point in the sugya. They're able to daven Ma'ariv during the day. V'shemami no mispal talmid acher rabbi, and as well you see that a student is able to daven behind the Rebbe, Ushmamina also lava kenegam espalim. And you see that it's also forbidden to pass in front of those who are davening Shemana Esrei. Says the Gemara, Masayla Rabbi Shimon Levi. This is a proof to Rabbi Shimon Levi. Why don't Rabbi Shimon Levi also lava kenegam espalim? Because Rabbi Shimon Levi says the same idea that it's forbidden to pass in front of those that are davening. And he says the Gemara, we have a testimony that Rabbi Ami Rabbi Asi used to walk in front of people who were middle of davening. Says no, Rabbi Ami Rabbi Asi chutz l'arba amas with the chalfi. Rabbi Ami Rabbi Asi were walking in front of people who were davening, but it was outside of Arba Amas. We think Dalet Amas is a kind of a new makom. So if you have a space of Dalet Amas, wherever somebody, that's not an issue. We don't have to be machmer on such a thing like this. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Yirmiyah hechi avid haki. How could Rabbi Yirmiyah do like this? Meaning, how could he daven next to his rabbi, behind his rabbi? Rabbi Yehuda Marav, la'olam al yispal adam, returning the page of Chazan base, that a person should not be davening like neged rabbi, rabbi should be davening opposite to Rebbe, not behind your Rebbe. That's not an appropriate thing. Why is it not appropriate davening behind the Rebbe? So if you look at Rashi, Rashi says it's a part of yuhara, right? If you daven next to your Rebbe, behind your Rebbe, there's a sort of ego. It's like you're equating yourself with your Rebbe. Taisus gives a different reason. Top Taisus says Perish Rashim Shem Yura Rabbi Yeshem Parshim Yura Kishem Mishtach El Rabbi. You know what the problem is? The problem is when you're bowing down. It looks like you're bowing down to the Rebbe. This is an issue. Yes. Rashi says it's a part of ego. If you look at the Rabbeinu Yonah had a bit of a different shot. Again, back to your Chesam and Beis. Rabbeinu Yonah said that v'dafka keneged pneim al b'tzidim lefchayishin and lahavar ba'alma. So if nobody says there's no problem if you're on the side of the Rebbe. We're talking here, but the front, behind, but not like the side is not going to be an issue. And then he says, what does it mean? Rabbi now down behind the Rebbe. So the Rabbeinu Yonah suggests that maybe that the reason it's also is mimnei hafsaka. That the reason is because of a hefsek. It's not so much yuara. It's not so much we're afraid you're dying down to the Rebbe. We're afraid of hefsek. You're going to die behind the Rebbe, all right? And you're diving along Shemana Esrei. What you're going to be matriach the Rebbe that he can't sit down. So it's just a pasha thing, right? The Rabbi Mimnei hafsaka kishem itztach Rabbi l'sei gim siyas la'acher b'rachim espav l'yuchal hafsek. The Rebbe, you're going to make the Rebbe not be able to hafsek. He won't be able to go to his seat. He won't be able to move because you're davening, and you shouldn't be, causing him this kind of an issue. That's the Rebbeinu. So 3 different possible reasons why you shouldn't daven behind your Rebbe. And again, the Rebbeinu points out that if you do it more than 4 amos away, then it's not a problem of kenegde, b'achayre, all that's fine. Why? Because shezek rishus acher b'fnei atzma. More than 4 amos is a different rishus. Okay, now. Before we go further, we skipped the bottom Taisus here on Chav Zayin, but I also just want to go back to that for a second. So Taisus says, so in the middle of the Rav Tzoli, the middle of Taisus says, the Sfir like Rabbi Yehuda, v'chen will come to the Shabbos. Later on, we're going to see in a few minutes that these daven Motzei Shabbos and Meir, they daven that on Shabbos as well. So Hainu Mishum the Sfir like Rabbi Yehuda in Tfilas Erev. Because they held like Rabbi Yehuda that you could daven Ma'ariv after Plaga Mincha. Afal Pikein says Taisus ain't Asur Lasas Malacha b'Motzei Shabbos miyad la'achar Plaga Mincha. Of course, that it's not. It's still forbidden to do any malacha after Plag. Just because you daven Ma'ariv and you're permitted to daven Ma'ariv early doesn't mean that you're permitted to do malacha. The Isser malacha remains. Shabbos says Taisus, so too regards to Shabbos. You want to now add Shabbos. You want to daven Ma'ariv early on Friday, so now you have Taisus Shabbos, and that Taisus Shabbos is like Shabbos. You have to treat it in that manner. Taisus Shabbos Yom Kippur, right? There's also Taisus Yom Kippur as well. The Karmel and Truman at Torah, right? The Torah mandates that we should have Taisus Shabbos and Taisus of Yom Kippur. Kain. Right, so in which case, you don't necessarily need that kind of a massive amount of time in order to do the Taisus for Shabbos. In fact, Rabbeinu Yonah points out, Rabbeinu Yonah says, Rabbeinu Yonah said we'll come back to this Rabbeinu Yonah in a minute, but Rabbeinu Yonah says that the type of Shabbos that you could do is just a culture. It doesn't have to be so long to go all the way to Plag Mincha. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. Okay, we'll come back to that. So now, the point that we are at is that Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba was davening by Rav by Geneba's house, and we learned out three things from his actions. Number one, that he davened next to the Rabbi, he davened behind the Rabbi, and he wasn't clearly concerned about this problem of davening behind the Rabbi. Either it's because of you are, or either it's because you are causing the Rabbi, pain because he can't sit down, or because of the fact that it looks like bowing in front of the Rabbi. Clearly, Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba is not scared of that. How could that be? So the Gemara now wants to explore this and understand the point. Says the Gemara, V'Tanya, Rabbi Lezer says, I'm a spell. Hey, Rabbi, V'anoisin Shalom LeRabbi, V'Maxer Shalom LeRabbi. Somebody who downs behind his Rabbi, he gives Shalom to his Rabbi, or he returns Shalom to his Rabbi, V'Chalik al Yeshiva Shel Rabbi, or he's Chalik on the Yeshiva of his Rabbi, It says something that he hasn't heard from his Rabbi. He causes the Shekhinah to leave the Jewish people. Shana B'Yirmiyah says the more and more answers. The Rabbi Yirmiyah is different. The Talmud Chaver Haba. He's a Talmud Chaver. What's the proof? After Rav finished davening Ma'ariv on Friday, Rabbi Yirmiyah says to him, "Did you stop doing malacha now?" Amalei in Bedilni says, "Yeah, I stopped doing malacha." V'loy Omar midu badal Mar. He didn't put in the honorific of Mar. He didn't say, "Did the master stop doing work?" Because the fact that he was, in a sense, equal to him, as even though he was his Talmud, he was a Talmud Chaver. There was a sense that he was a student, in a sense that he was somewhat equal, and therefore he was able to talk like this to his Rabbi. Now, point number one, we have to focus on over here. There's a lot of things that we have to get across. Is that this would seem now to answer the question of how could Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba daven behind Rav? Our Prussian answer that as Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba is a Talmud Chaver. Doesn't contradict the basic premise. If you're not a Talmud Chaver, you're just a regular Talmud, then you shouldn't be doing it. If you're an equal, that's not a problem. If you're a Talmud Chaver, it's not a problem. If you're a regular Talmud, don't do it, either because of Yuara, either because of Hefsek, or because of the fact that Rabbi. Those are the three problems. Fine. Second, we said if you look at the various cases that we're quoting here from Rabbi Lezer, we said Hanaisin Shalom LeRabbi. If you give Shalom to Rabbi, it's like what? It's like causing a gullus to come in the world. Like what does it mean? So you have to look at Rashi. What does Rashi tell us? What does it mean Shalom LeRabbi? Kishar Kol Adam Shalom Alecha V'lo Amar Lo Shalom Alecha Rabbi. The problem is not saying Shalom to the guy. Of course you're allowed to. If you're supposed to say Shalom Alecha to your Rabbi. Problem is saying Shalom Aleichem without saying Shalom Aleichem Rebbe. Right? You're not giving him the proper honorific, so that's how you're causing the Shekhinah to leave the world. Taisus says the same. Taisus says only a Talmud Chaver would be permitted to just say Shalom without saying Shalom Aleichem Rebbe. However, if you look at Rabbeinu Yonah has a different understanding. Rabbeinu Yonah says, what is the problem of saying Shalom? Says Rabbeinu Yonah, the problem is you said Shalom Aleichem to him first. Right? You know, you go to Rahman al-Islam, you go to an Aval's house, right? What's the proper way? We discussed this, right? Remember we discussed back on, what was it, Vav or something? We said that the schar, right? We said the schar of the base Aval, right? We said above the Gemara said, Amar Papa Igor the Beit Hamya Shtikusa, right? Going to an Aval's house, the schar is shutting your mouth. Till the Aval says something to you, you have to keep your mouth quiet. So Rabbeinu answers the problem is not saying Shalom Aleichem to the Rabbi. The problem is saying Shalom Aleichem to the Rabbi before he says Shalom to you. That's not the way it's supposed to be. You stand there in mute fear. Right, in fear of the Rabbi. You don't say a word to him because you're petrified. He's the Rabbi. And that's why we had to do this Rabbeinu Yonah. Right? Because why? Because we just had this Gemara on Sunday. Right? We discussed the Gemara Shabbos Pei Tes. Right? Where I said the only way I ever understood in this Gemara is like when you come to, coming somebody who's rating you on. Hey, you don't say hello to me? right? Because you remember the Gemara said, right? What was the lashon of the Gemara there? That Moshe Rabbeinu is coming up to heaven, and the Rebbe Shem saying, "What, you don't say hello?" Moshe Rabbeinu says, "I can't." An Eved can't speak before the master. That's Rabbeinu Yonah is in the same. So his word is not the word Shalom Aleichem instead of Rebbe. The word is you don't talk till the Rebbe speaks. The Rebbe says Shalom Aleichem, you say Shalom Aleichem back. So that's his way of understanding why it's being taking the gula from the world if you are not having proper respect for the Rebbe. Okay, the next one is my favorite one. It sounds like, if you notice, these Rabbeinu Yonah, he's adding in this like a little knetch here, a little knetch there. You can't just read it and understand it, just push it. So what's the next one that I wanted to focus on? Someone who says something that he didn't hear over in the name of his Rebbe. What does it mean? He didn't hear over in the name of his Rebbe. So if you look, there's a Gemara that we have in Sukkah Chav Ches. The Gemara tells us about Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, that miyamav lo yisach sichas chulen, Imam, she never said a word that was not in learning. He never said over anything that ever heard from his Rebbe in his life. Never. And if you look, also, we say the same exact thing about Rebbe Eliezer ben Horkinus. They never said over anything in the name of his Rebbe they never heard. And that is also Gemara Sukkah Chav Zayin, also Yuma Pei Vav, Samach Vav. So it sounds like the simple reading of this Gemara is that we are lauding those that only say over things that they heard from the Rebbe, and they don't make stuff up. This is the testimony by Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. This is the testimony of Eliezer ben Horkinus. What's my problem with this? My problem with this has always been that we have a different testimony about Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkinus. The Avishab Nassan tells us that and we have also speculated the whole story about a whole backstory of Rabbi Eliezer. Anyhow, Eliezer ben Horkinus once got up and gave a shir, and he said things that no one ever heard before. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was the Alman, and he gave him a big kiss. No one ever heard these things before. Meaning he didn't say over the name of Rebbe, he was making stuff up, and it was great, unbelievable chidushim. Right? If you say that there's such a thing as a chiddush, then what's by definition? Something you didn't hear from your Rebbe. You're making it up. You have good proofs from it. You heard stuff from your Rebbe. It's helping you get there, but you're making stuff up. So this always bothered me as a fundamental question. And the Pashat, I think the way to answer it is with Rabbeinu Yonah, of course. Rabbeinu Yonah, in one word, literally one line, Rabbeinu Yonah says like this: the problem is that you didn't hear something from your Rebbe and you're saying it over in his name. This always reminds me of Chassam Sofer. Chassam Sofer had somebody, he was wanting to say, I have no problem if you want to say over my Torah in your name. Just do me a favor, don't say over your Torah in my name. Right? You got it? So that's the issue here. If that's the issue here, then that explains the Gemara, and that's easy. The problem is, look at Rabbeinu Chanan says, so Dov Shloshem Pi Rabbi, perish as Rabbeinu Chanan Shloimar Dover Shloshem Mi Rabbi Ma'olam. That you don't say over something you never heard from your Rebbe at all, which is the Pasha understanding of the Gemara. Again, according to that, I have a question about the fact that what does Chiddush mean? How do you understand this? Rabbi Nasser, Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkinus? We'll have to leave that. Moving on. Continues the Gemara. So we are now a few lines, 10 lines or so from the top. The Gemara is now asking about Rav. Did Rav really not work on Friday after Plag when he had davened Ma'ariv? Says about me Badal. Did Rav really stop working? The Omar Rebbe Oven. Rebbe Oven said, "Pamachas is spelled Rebbe shal Shabbos be'erev Shabbos." It was one time where Rebbe davened early on Friday night. He davened early. V'nichnas lemechatz, and he went into the bathhouse. V'yotza v'shon olam pirkin, and then he got out and he gave us a shir. V'adayin lechashech, and still not gotten dark yet. So what's the Gemara's proof from this? Is that since you're not allowed to go to the bathhouse on Shabbos, it's a proof that you're allowed to do malacha after you daven Friday night on Friday. Says the Gemara, Amarava, who the nichnas lazia. What not talking about he went to the bathhouse was using the water. No, which would mean then he's doing things that are on Shabbos, not necessarily appropriate. I'm not getting into the whole long conversation about going to the mikvah on Shabbos. We'll leave that for another time. However, Rava says we're not talking about going to the mikveh to use the water. No, we're talking about he's going to the bathhouse. He's coming to sweat, right? People go to the schwitz to sweat. It's not a vart of any question about using water. Schita, all this topic is not relevant. He's just going to the sweat. It's healthy. That's why he went in. The gezerah happen. It was before the gezerah, before the made a gezerah that on Shabbos you're not to do this. So then there was no issue. So you can't have a proof from here. Rebbe went in there on Friday after he davened already Ma'ariv, that therefore you see he was still doing Avodah. No, it's not a proof because this is not Avodah, and it was before the Gezerah, so there's no proof at all from this story. Says the Gemara, Aini, is this true? Rabbi gave Rav Dimi Bar Levoy, he gave him permission to smoke his baskets. I don't ask me how you do this or what this actually means. I don't know, but Barash is la'ashin estem begafris. Gafris v'melach sreifa kol arza. So somehow this was the way you did baskets, which would be clearly an avodah, and he's letting him do this when on Erev Shabbos after he already davened Ma'ariv. Says the Gemara, no. Ahu te'usa havoy. What happened was, as Rashi explains, was Yom HaMu'unan. It was a very cloudy day. They don't have watches, so they thought that it was really already dark, and therefore they davened. So they thought it was Shabbos. Then all of a sudden the sun appears back, so they realized, oh, it's the middle of the day. So therefore, since it was a mistake, since it was a tusav, it was a mistake. So they didn't really accept Shabbos. So therefore, he said to them that you could work; it's not a problem. The more asked, to usami hadra, would you normally say that you go back to daven again? Meaning that since now it's the daytime, then you're going to have to daven again Friday night. And therefore, since you're going to have to daven again Friday night, so therefore today it's still Friday, you're still permitted to do malacha. Or to usa mihadra, do you think you by mistakes you go back? It's not true. The Amar Avidan, there was a rabbi, his name was Avidan, he said, Hamachas Naskash Shemayim Ba'avim was one time when the clouds it was a very cloudy day. Everyone thought it was in the middle of the night. And they ended up davening Ma'ariv on Motzei Shabbos. They davened on Shabbos. And then it ended up becoming sunny again. Then they came and asked Rebbe, what should they do? She said, well, once they daven already. So what do you see? You see from here that when the situation of a tush, that you don't go back. And since the situation of a tush, they didn't go back, maybe you would say, oh, well, therefore, then it will be usher because you already daven from Friday night on Friday, so maybe it's usher in the halacha. Then no. There's no proof from here at all. Shani tzibur match rechin lahu. You're not going to matriach a tzibur. The tzibur already did it. He did it. But by yachid, you would have to go back. By yachid, you would have to go back and daven again. But there's no proof here in terms of work. Work is irrelevant to this point. When you daven by mistake, you didn't accept Shabbos, and of course, you would be able to continue on working if it was a mistake. Whether or not you have to go back and daven again would depend if you're in a tzibur or by yourself. If you're in a tzibur, you would have to rely on the earlier daven, which was done by mistake. But if you're by a yachid, then you could daven, of course, on your own again. You should daven, of course, on your own again. That is the Gemara here until the two dots. We have one Rabbi Yana more that I wanted to get to. There's a big Rabbi Yana here. So again, back on Yud Chesam Beis, the Rabbi Yana says like this: Rav Tzoli Shel Shabbos Erev Shabbos. What does it mean that Rav would daven of Erev Shabbos? He would daven the Friday night davening. Rabbi Yana adds in that he would daven Shema later on. Remember, this is a topic that we had way back in the beginning, now a few months ago, right? We discussed what is the right time for saying Shema of the evening. And we had all the different machlekes in. But everyone agrees that it's relatively late. You can't be davening Shema for the evening and be Yaitz design by day. And then we end up with a huge machlekes because a lot of people daven Ma'ariv early. They daven Ma'ariv before it says. So what do you do about Shema? Repeating Shema. Do you repeat Shema or can you simply rely on the Kriyat Shema Lamita? Is that sufficient? We had a machlekes there. Rashi tells we had a whole fun time when we discussed it then. So Rabbi points out number one that just because Rav daven early, whoever davens early on a Friday night, they have to remember to repeat the Kriyat Shema in its proper time. The Afmishla is some gula tefillah, but then Rabbeinu Yonah bring, he knows that you're bored and you don't want to forget that Gemara before. So what about gula tefillah? Don't you need to say gula tefillah? And we had that as the Gemara as well. You remember the Gemara? We had that on Dal and Mabez, right? That the person should be saying gula to tefillah not just in the morning, but also in the evening. Right, Rabbi Shmuel Levi, sorry, there was Machaz Rabbi Shmuel Levi Rabbi Yochanan Ezel ben Olam Haba. That's Taimek Gula Tefillah Shel Arvis. Rabbi Yochanan said that who's been Olam Haba and Dalan Beis was somebody who's Taimek Gula to Tefillah. So if you're going to daven Shema alone by itself, you're not going to have that. You're going to be now in a situation where you're not being Taimek Gula to Tefillah. So this is the question that Rabbi Yonah says. He says, look, since you have a mitzvah, you want to be Kabbalah Shabbos early, so even though it's true, Rabbi Yochanan says someone who's going to be a Ben Elam Haba, then we're saying go to Tefillah. When it comes to a Dvar Mitzvah, of Teis Shabbos, we're not worried about this. So, then remaining continues, and what is this time? Then we plug Mincha Ve'elach. We're talking about somebody's diving Friday night earlier than flag. And then Rabbeinu says something very interesting. From that point on, from Plag, you're able to accept Shabbos in your davening. If someone wants to accept Shabbos before Plag Mincha, cannot do that. Before Plag Mincha, you can't accept Shabbos. Says Rabbeinu Yonah, very interesting. When somebody wants to recall Shabbos from Plag Mincha, you have to make sure to light candles before. Why? Because once you Mekabel Shabbos early, then it's Shabbos for you. Then you can't light candles anymore. So you have to light early. Then you really shouldn't be doing any malacha after that. So that was one part of the Rebbeinu I want to mention. I want to skip a few lines, and he quotes here from Rabbeinu Yaakov Meir Orleans. What does he say? From Rabbi Yaakov Meir Orleans, Shabbos die b'choshu, is what I was mentioning before. That even though Teis Shabbos, enough for a second, you don't have to do Teis Shabbos from Plag Mincha. A few minutes is more than enough. We do 18 minutes, right? If you ever go to Yerushalayim, what do they do in Yerushalayim? 40 minutes, right? And I have to admit that I've broken that in the past. You take a cab to the Kaisel, and I always feel a little bad because the minute in Yerushalayim is Teis Shabbos is 40 minutes, not 18 minutes. Okay. So Shabbos Teis Shabbos b'chosha afilu hachi im hu ma'aseh harbe yosef v'chal teisefes have v'chayav alav. Right. If a person is going to be ma'aseh a lot more, it's going to be called the valid teisefes, then it'll be chayav on if you're doing stuff that you're not supposed to be doing. On Shabbos. Even though you might say, okay, well, this is really just Rabbanan. I feel also but really you shouldn't be doing any Isim Malacha because it's like a test of Shabbos, it should be treated as such. The same way, like if somebody's going to take off Truma, normally, right, what's the Raisa for Truma? A Chita Achas is sufficient for Truma. It's not like Meiser has to be a percentage. A Truma is nothing. We have a meaning to take off, a nicer amount, but you don't have to. But if somebody does take off a nicer amount, it's Truma. You have to treat it as such. It says the same is true with regards to Teis v'Shabbos. In term harbe hakol dain le truma. That would be if somebody takes off extra for truma, that's still truma. Miu mispal mi'ayjam b'tos. But if somebody davened early by mistake, shuyem hamunin, because that's just a cloudy day. By chashu laila b'achakos l'arach Hashemes, then tzarich last over the spalel. Av b'shespal and plug min chaveil came shon eskaven l'spal. Since he didn't have kavanah for that, then he has to daven again after shkia appropriately, and of course you can do malacha, etc. No issues at all. He concludes, I skip another few lines, he concludes, Rabbi Moshe Bar Yosef Narboni. Rabbi Moshe Narboni from Narbonne, right, from the south of France. So what does he say? He says, Shem Toat Tzibur Be'er Shabbos V'Spal If the Tzibur made a mistake and they davened too early because they thought it was already dark, then we're not going to require a Tzibur to do so because the Tircha the Tzibur. However, a Yachid, however, we would be matriachin to daven again. So this is the Gemara until here. Now the next piece of Gemara. It says Amar Rav Chia bar Oven, two dots. Amar Rav Chia bar Oven, Rav Tzoli Shal Shabbos B'Erev Shabbos. Rav would daven on Friday after Plag, he would daven for Shabbos. So now we're not saying just to Geneva his house, we're saying it as a general thing. This is Rav would take in Shabbos early. Rabbi Shaya matzah shamotzoi Shabbos b'Shabbos. Rabbi Shaya would daven motzoi Shabbos early. Right? He would daven motzei Shabbos early. So what about Taisvus Shabbos? Why did he daven early? Not sure. Let's look at Taisvus. Taisvus Salish motzoi Shabbos b'Shabbos. Skip about halfway down. Taisvus says, well, we shouldn't skip. We'll just run through. Yesh lam the hakam marish yesh tzarich mitzvah last time it's Shabbos. Again, let's limol tinak lo yayin lavdola im lo yaktim. Dvar tzarich lo yisef michal alakash daraisa aval bechinam loy upshita shloy memarim lahavdil uspasam et tzavos b'Shabbos. The gam melacha asim chashecha. It says pashit. You should understand that they did not do melacha on Shabbos. Of course not. They were davening. Why are they davening? Because they had something they had to take care of. Right? They had whatever, Dvar Mitzvah, something very important. So that's what they would daven Ma'ariv early in those situations. But if it wasn't for Dvar Mitzvah, they never daven Ma'ariv early. That's Tais just pointing out. Okay. Rav, it's Tzoli Shal Shabbos Be'erev Shabbos. So Rav, when he would daven on Friday night, davening, he would daven it on after Plaga Mincha. So Amar Kiddush Alakais, Amar Kiddush Alakais, would he say Kiddush or not? Did he say Kiddush early or not? Says the Gemara Tashma, the Rabbi Yechon Amar Shmuel, the Amar of Nachman, I'm sorry, Amar Shmuel, Mispalam Shal Shabbos Ve'ev Shabbos, Ve'Amar Kiddush Alakais, Ve'Halcha So Kavasei. Yes, in fact, he would make Kiddush early as well. Rabbi Yishai Matzah Shamotzoi Shabbos b'Shabbos. Rabbi Yishai, we said that he would daven Motzei Shabbos on Shabbos. Amar Avdol Lakos, Amar Avdol Lakos. They say Havdalah or not early. Says the Gemara Tashma, Amar Rabbi Yudam Shmuel, Mispalam Shamotzoi Shabbos b'Shabbos. Amar Avdol Lakos. Yeah, we have a proof that he would not just daven Ma'ariv early on Shabbos, but also he would say Havdalah on the Kais. Amar Zir, Amar Vasi, Amar Blazer, Amar B'chanina, Amar Rav. Right, that's a bit of a mouthful, but what happened? Bitzad Zeh, Amor Bitzad Amud Zeh, Spal Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi Shal Shabbos. By this pillar, Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi would daven on Friday after Plag. He would daven for Shabbos davening. When Ula came, he disagreed. It was not by this pillar, it was by this palm tree. It wasn't Rabbi Yossi, it was another one of the 5 pillars, of the 5 palms, as the Gemara Shabbos tells us about. Rabbi Yossi had the 5 Chamesh Bilas Ba'alti, and he planted 5 cedars. Right, so it wasn't Rabbi Shmuel Bersi, it was Rabbi Yossi. Erev Shabbos happened. It wasn't he wasn't davening Friday night on Erev Shabbos, but rather El Shemot Shabbos Shabbos. So every part of the story he had wrong. But either way, it's related to each topic, which is davening early, either Friday night davening after Plag or Motzei Shabbos davening after Plag. As Teza says, not with regards to Shabbos. With regards to Shabbos, Teza Shabbos. With regards to Shabbos, is wonderful. Motzei Shabbos is also Teish Shabbos. Motzei Shabbos is also in to keep Shabbos later. Why did they daven early? Because there was some Dvar Mitzvah, was something that had to be done, had to be taken care of. Okay, so we will continue here. We have another couple minutes. We will just continue the Gemara. So the Gemara says, Tfilas ha'erev ein la keva. Tfilas ha'erev doesn't have a set time. My ein la keva says, what does that mean? Doesn't have a set time. Ilam b'di boy masi kulil leilia. Listen to Tfilas ha'erev kol ha'layla. If we're talking about the fact that it doesn't have a set time, that you could daven all night, so why didn't it say that Tfilas ha'erev is kol ha'layla? Why is the Mishnah telling us in the beginning of this 4th parak that Tfilas ha'erev is ein la keva? It doesn't have a set time. Just tell us Tfilas ha'erev is the whole night. It must be that what this Gemara is teaching us is that Tfilas ha'erev is a reshus. Because Rav Huda says the name of Shmuel, Tfilas ha'erev is Rabbi Gamliel, Amar Chayva, B'Shua, Amar Reshus, Amar Gamliel, whether or not Ma'ariv is a Reshus or a Chayva. Amar Abaya, Halach Kedivri Amar Chayva. Abaya says that there's like we paskin, like the Madam who holds that Ma'ariv is a Chayv, it's a requirement. Rav Amar Halach Kedivri Amar Reshus, and Rav says that the Halach is like the Madam who holds it's a Reshus. So in Halach, and then Machlokes the Abaya and Rav Huda, we all like. We all like Rav, except for Yachagam, hold like Abaya. But as I pointed out before, look at the side of the Gemara here, you'll see that it says Rav. And we have other gears that say that there's Rav and Shmuel arguing over here as well. And then the halacha will be like what? We have Rav and Shmuel. Rav is halacha by what? By Surah, and Rav by and Shmuel like by Mammon. So then this will be Isur. So we hold like Rav that it is a Rishus. Okay. So the halacha will then seem to be if it's Rav and Shmuel the Gemara, then we pass like Rav, then Ma'ariv is a Rishus. And if it's a Rav and the Gemara, then the halach is like Rava. And what does Rava hold? Halach is a rishus. So either way, Ma'ariv is a rishus. So therefore, what do you have to have Ma'ariv? What does Taisa say? Look at Taisa's. Taisa Hilchasa Kav say the Rav. I'm sorry, halach is different rishus. Lav davka rishus doesn't mean really rishus. And you have to remember what did Taisa say on Chavav. Taisa signed back to Chavav Manal. We had that Taisa. Taisa says, what does it mean rishus when we talk about Ma'ariv? Taisa says wasn't really a rishus. It's only rishus when you have a mitzvah. Then you don't have to daven Ma'ariv. But if you don't have another mitzvah, then it is a chayv. You must daven Ma'ariv. All right, we will stop over here and start doing the story tomorrow. Okay.